Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, my colleague Tim Minaya, PRI's Director of Communications, interviewed Senator Pat Bates, California's Senate Republican leader. Senator Bates represents California's 36th district, over 1 million Californians in the San Diego and Orange County areas. She was first elected in 2014 and was elected Senate Republican leader in 2017. Previously, she was a member of the Orange County Board of Supervisors, served 6 years in the State Assembly, and was mayor of Laguna Niguel. Tim discussed a wide range of issues with Senator Bates, from budget negotiations to single-payer health care, her role as leader of the Senate, to her early years as a social worker, serving on the front lines to help California's neediest families. We think you'll enjoy the interview. Thanks for joining us.
Well, Senator Bates, thank you for joining us on the PRI podcast. We're here at your office at the state capitol in Sacramento, and we're going to kind of go through all the hot issues that are on your plate and the plate of Californians these days. I wanted to ask you about something. I had the opportunity to see you at the PPIC lunch a few months back, and what I thought was very interesting, you were asked, and every year the legislative leaders, do a luncheon there, and they ask them about their priorities for the year. And I thought it was interesting that you were asked what's your top priority, and you gave what some may consider a surprising answer for a Republican, which is reducing poverty. And so many people may not know that your background as a social worker before getting into politics and getting into this place. So could you share with our listeners how your past work in that field influences what you're doing today as a senator and as Republican leader?
Well, thank you, Tim. Good question. And clearly, looking at California today, when we have the highest poverty rate. And I think about my career many, many years ago, over 20 years ago, working in the poverty capitals of Los Angeles. I worked in Southeast LA. It troubled me as a young person that I was probably 4 or 5 years older than some of my own clients, that they didn't have the opportunities that I had because they had been born into poverty and they remain in poverty. And so when I had an opportunity to become a decision maker as a social worker, we were frustrated with the fact that the programs that were there didn't really lift people out of poverty. It actually kind of captured them in poverty because of the way the grants were structured, what you could and couldn't own. You couldn't have a car. That became part of your personal property. How do you get to work? You didn't have child care. So these were the things that troubled me as a young person, basically in the same generation of the people I was interviewing. And I said, we need to do something about that. So here I am, an opportunity to focus on that. The affordability issue in California is huge. We know that we're driving people into poverty because of the cost of housing. What are we doing about that? The programs that have come forward, they don't solve the problem. So it has become a focus. And one of the things that I want my 4 years here, I'm coming up to a re-election, but hopefully I'll be 8 years, that I can really, if not get specific legislation passed, we raise the awareness. We raise our voices and say this has to be the number one priority because everybody deserves the quality of life that many of us have had the opportunity and many do not. So that's my goal.
Poverty, is one of the key issues for PRI in 2018. And our Kerry Jackson released a brief earlier this year called Good Intentions that caused a national firestorm, a lot more than we thought. And it asked the question that you did, why is kind of blue California the capital of poverty in America? And when you think about it, in one of the most wealthy states in the country, it doesn't make any sense. So kind of what do you think on the big issues that we're facing in the legislature as it comes to poverty? What are your thoughts on some of these issues that are being kicked around? And what do you think is the proper role for government versus the private sector in trying to lift people out of poverty and help people in need?
That was a very interesting article that came out showing that the outcomes for the nonprofits, the private organizations, are better than government. Why is that? Well, government is cookie cutter, and private industry, nonprofits, can look at each individual when they do a case management. And that is what I think is really, really important. We have tried with a couple of bills to bring a partnership with social services and those who are providing that in private settings, and haven't had success yet because of this drug testing issue. And that we know is a real issue. Substance abuse takes many young people and puts them in very, very difficult situations in terms of rehabilitation. One of my bills was to help St. John's here in Sacramento, which is a wraparound program. They do random drug testing. The women that came up to testify, all very young, had their children very young, 16, 17, 18, lost their children because of substance abuse and those child abuse issues that come with that, bad partnerships. They wanted to be drug tested. It was an incentive for them, but because that was part of it and what the federal regulations are that are adopted by the state, the program was not approved. So I think government has to take a second look at what they require and follow to some degree what the private organizations are able to do, because these are people who enter those programs voluntarily. So taking that as a prototype is very, very important. We need to look to our private nonprofits that are doing a good job, adopt some of those, and then have the partnerships with them, because the money is well spent. If we move people out of substance abuse, we move them out of poverty, and we have them in families where they're now good parents. And if good parenting is bringing forward great product, kids that don't get involved in criminal behavior, all the things that we see that really undermine the quality of life going forward for the present and the future, they're things that private nonprofits are doing a better job at. And we can adopt those. It's a minor change, I think, in legislation at the federal and the state level can make an incredibly great difference in opportunities. So I keep pushing that. We introduce it every year. We try every year. And I think there's more and more awareness that this is not the wrong path to take.
As an aside on that, we've toured St. John's, and you can't help when you go there, but feel inspired by the great work that they're doing. You see the lives that are really turned around, and it's a shame that government it really is kind of standing in the way of what they're doing. And we've interviewed Michelle Steeb on the podcast before, and hopefully we'll be able to come to some resolution here, because programs like that really are making a difference, and government really should be a partner, not a hindrance to what they're doing.
They have incentives, and I used in my presentation the example of Weight Watchers. You want to lose weight, so you get weighed. You have to go in every week and get weighed to see if you made your goal. These young women were saying the same thing. Knowing that I'm going to be drug tested, not knowing when it's going to happen, it's an incentive. It's a goal I set to get off the substance that I am abusing. And it really helps my kids, and when the joy of achieving that on a monthly, a weekly, a yearly basis, so they're out, independent. It's just amazing to see the change in the behavior. So we need to build that into our government programs, and I feel very passionate about that.
Hand in hand with poverty is our housing crisis. And, last year the legislature passed this whole package of bills to solve the housing crisis, yet we're still persisting with the lack of affordability. There was a recent state report that came out that found that most cities and counties aren't hitting their housing goals, and they recommended a lot of reforms to reform the permit and regulation process to speed the approval of housing construction. So in your view, given what we've done last year, what other reforms should be adopted to boost housing construction and supply in California?
Well, here we go. We have to do something about CEQA. We've been talking about it. The governor has basically mentioned it, but we can't seem to get the right people in the room at the same time around the table, lock the door and say, let's solve the problem. And I truly believe if we had all the stakeholders come together and say, if we reform CEQA, not to diminish it, because it has been very, very important to the environmental quality of life in the state, but it needs to be fast-tracked. There needs to be guards on the way it's used, basically by both sides of an argument over development. So I'd say that's number one. I think that the package where it failed the most was the requirement for project labor agreements and prevailing wage, sending the cost of those homes that were going to be fast-tracked. What was it, another $64,000 to $80,000 additional because of that? I think we need to take a look at that when we're talking about multifamily densification, that if you're going to fast-track that, use good environmental quality standards, fast-track those, help developers incentivize, and most importantly, incentivize local governments in their zoning and their planning. That's very important. I was a mayor and a council member, and we wanted more development, but we wanted it in certain areas of our city, and we need to get to incentivize local governments to take a look at what's available in their cities that does not impact mobility. A lot of it has to do with a concern over transportation when you densify densify, what it's going to do to the mobility to and from the work, the freeways, all of that. The parking issues are huge when you don't have parking standards. Incentivize local governments to solve those problems at the local level by giving them opportunities on a faster track to meet what the state requires in the arena, the requirement for housing at every level. So I think there's a lot more thought needs to go into what are the obstacles to getting more foundations, more, nails, bolts, wood built. What are those obstacles? And we all kind of know what they are, but we've never put them together in a package and saying, bottom line, CEQA gets in the way, and certainly calling local governments NIMBY so that then there's lots of lawsuits that happen. I think we need to take a look at litigation, CEQA, fast track.
So one of the other hot issues of this session is single payer. I'm sure the phones of your district office have been ringing off the hook on that. And we're seeing in this election year, it's really dominating Democratic politics in the race for governor and the different Democratic assembly battles. Last year, the Senate passed SB 562, which is now stalled in the assembly. But we know if you've got 21 and 41 votes, nothing's ever dead until the last night of session. So, and then in Washington, we have the kind of continued battle over what to do with the repeal and replace of Obamacare. So given all this, what course do you think California should take on health care reform in the coming months and years?
Well, it's certainly on the table, and it can't be ignored. I don't believe there's someone who wouldn't agree that everyone deserves health care, certainly for the quality of their health life, for the longevity, for productivity, and for a joy, to be pain-free. We have to find something that's affordable, and that's most vexing. I'm not an expert. I've talked to many doctors. They believe that the Medicare plan has been, viable. We hear that it's going to run out of, money in another decade. I think it's coming up. So how do we fund it? And I think that is something that should, really be the primary topic. How do we provide universal health care, not necessarily single payer for one state? What we're talking about, $400 billion? Well, $200 billion of that certainly can be transferred from the federal government if they're willing to do that. And, we don't know with our relationships with Washington if that's possible. But where does the other $200 billion? Well, it's another tax. And I think the plan that was put forward indicated that you wouldn't be able to keep the insurance you currently have. I think it's approaching 80 or 90% of people are very comfortable with what they have and the cost of that, even though it's gone up. So isn't there a model out there that we can grab onto, modify it to some degree to ensure that everyone's covered? And I toss that to the experts in the insurance industry, our physicians, and certainly at the federal level. And I think that they can do a better job than they have. It's certainly going to continue the debate, but I believe that my caucus, my members, and we as Republicans, we feel strongly about people having health care, good health care. And so we're at the table. It's just that some of the ideas that have been put forth, certainly in Washington, they fall on deaf ears because it's almost a partisan battle. We got to get that out of it because I think we all believe that our fellow man deserves the same kind of health coverage and health care that we want for ourselves. So I'm there to sit at the table and try to work through it. I haven't been invited yet, but perhaps I'll do that in my next term.
I thought one thing was interesting at that PPIC lunch earlier in the year, Mr. Speaker was on before you were, and when asked about this bill, he said, well, it's cost double the state budget. We have no way to pay for it and needs a waiver from Washington. So in otherwise, a perfect bill. But that sort of leads into my question about costs. We're about to dive into the annual state budget fight. And it seems, from having been around this place for a couple of decades, it seems like the toughest budget fights are years like this when we're in relatively good times. So how do you see this year's state budget fight shaping up? And what do you think, getting out your crystal ball, what do you think Jerry Brown's final budget will ultimately look like?
If it looks close to what was presented in January, we were comfortable with the surplus going to the areas that it was scheduled for. We had additional money for career tech. We had additional money for the rainy day fund. Actually, the governor proposed more than we were asking for. I think we had a 222 plan, $2 billion to reduce the pension liability, $2 billion into the rainy day fund, and it was $2 billion for infrastructure, so we wouldn't be looking at more taxes and fees on that. And he came out close to that, although we have SB1 and the taxes on gas. We don't support that. Our original plan on mobility last year was 2015, 2016. We had a plan that wouldn't have required the taxes and fees fees, and we were looking at $5 to $6 billion that we would be able to put towards the transportation infrastructure issues without fees and taxes, given the money that was already available in the transportation budgets that have been, drained off to other purposes. So if he sticks with what he presented and he doesn't let those who want to spend rather than save kind of take center stage, I think it probably is not going to be as bad as it's been in previous years. If we can say one thing about the governor, it's that he has been more of a fiscal conservative with his own party than they ever imagined he would be. So I'm not on budget committee, and actually we haven't had that many briefings specifically at this point in time. That will probably ramp up in the next couple of weeks, so I'll be listening closely. But if he sticks closer to that plan, I think that that's something that our members of our budget committee, if they have minor amendments to where the money ought to be directed, that will probably be less of a partisan fight, more of a discussion and a consensus when it goes to conference committee. That's what I hope. So stay tuned.
My old boss and your former colleague Connie Conway would always say Jerry Brown is the grown-up in the room, and especially on budget issues, you really see that pan out. One of the things that we mention, taxes, has been kind of the big issue in Washington to, a bigger extent over the last 6 months, but certainly always is a big topic in Sacramento. And, you see Senator De Leon had his complicated scheme, for lack of a better word, to try to get around the Trump tax cuts. And you had a couple of Assembly Democrats propose doubling corporate income tax because California businesses, quote, made out like bandits under what Washington did. What are some of your thoughts on these proposals, and what does it really say about Sacramento's priorities that some are pushing these increased taxes in times of boom and record tax revenue for the state?
I'm not sure why we just don't look at reducing the taxes in California rather than trying to find ways around what Washington's doing. I mean, this is California. We're California legislators. We're California leaders in policy making. Why can't we sit down and come up with a plan that helps Californians lower their taxes? When you do that, they have more discretionary income to put into society, into business. I mean, it's called Econ 101. More discretionary income goes to services and products, and that's how the economy ramps up. Too simple? Not for me. And when I was in college, this was preached all the time. So it was troubling to see that we're looking at kind of schemes around, but nothing that's direct. And I think, again, focusing on the high wage earner, if we drive them out of the state, the percentage of the taxes that come into the general fund come from the very wealthy, the largest percentage. If we're driving those people out of the state because the taxes get so high that even their discretionary income is minimized, and they start worrying about, quality of life, housing, sending their kids to college, what happens then? Where's the revenue base? So I think we need to take a long, hard look at how we can help business, reduction of fees and taxes, how we can help just the, workaday middle-class Californian in terms of what they're having to pay. And then we go back to the health issue. If we had this plan that came forward, more of their discretionary income would have been reduced, paying more for health care that they currently have and they like that's less costly. So it's just a quagmire of trying to avoid reducing the tax structure in California. We've got to get over that.
So taxes obviously are a big topic with transportation too. You talked a little bit earlier about your 222 plan. One of the other big issues with transportation is high-speed rail, and it's back in the news. We heard recently the updated business plan that the cost had gone up to $77 billion, and it could go as high as $98 billion. But we've been debating this how long? I think back in 2008 was when the bond measure was on the ballot. But it seems we're kind of stuck in neutral with this. We have rising costs. It's pretty certain we're not going to get any more money from Washington. There's no real private investment, and there's no real plan to complete the whole system. So in your view, what will it take to finally put the brakes on this, quote, train to nowhere?
I am excited about the audit that's going on, bipartisan. So finally, there's an awakening on both sides of the aisle that we might need to do a major course correction with high-speed rail. What is there that, can be salvaged? Those are things left to the experts who are out there in the field working on this. But I heard from friends from the East Coast, actually, when the first idea was put out there that we were going to construct this brand new system called the high-speed rail bullet train. And one of my colleagues said, why don't they just take the existing using rail, work with the rail operators and start a program that improves what we currently have by grade separations, tunnels where those are possible so that you actually can travel at a higher speed, actually reduce the safety issues that are there when they do these intersections that are problematic, slowing down the trains. So the quiet zones that we have to go back to Washington to get, because when I served on Orange County Transportation Authority, we did a lot of that. So we have a system. Let's make the one we have better, faster, and less expensive, and it honors the promise of being able to get from San Francisco to LA or LA to San Francisco and down to San Diego. We connect the whole state. This one doesn't. And I think the most disappointment looking at this new plan is that they've actually shortened the route and reduced the speed, and it costs more money. So it just does not compute in terms of what was promised voters when they said that's a good idea. Along the way, more and more of our taxpayer voter residents out there saying, stop, this is not working. Let's do a course correction right now so we get something that helps us all, and this is not going to get us there. And, there are more and more non-believers in high-speed rail, more and more believers that it's not working, and more calling for a better system that improves the current one we have.
Finally, you've been Republican leader now for about a year. I think you just celebrated your anniversary, so happy anniversary. How have you found it transitioning to be leader of the caucus rather than just a senator representing your district? And now that you've had a year to be in the job, what has surprised you the most about being the leader, and what maybe one or two things would you like to accomplish this session and going forward as Republican leader?
Great question. I don't know if I've been able to analyze. We're so in the weeds. I come every day. I have two objectives, two goals as leader. One is political and one is policy. On the political side, my goal is to ensure that the 13 members I currently have, I still fill not less than 13 chairs. So that's my political aim. To accomplish that, my job is to make sure that my members are well versed in the policy issues that Californians care about that really matter. So making sure that we have the best of the best in terms of our policy analysis so that they are well equipped to understand support or opposition to those matters, to those issues that matter so much with the public. And we spend a lot of time on that. On the political front, making sure that they have the resources that they need to connect with their districts. Now, with social media, I'm learning, if you want to know something really different, I had no idea about how all of that works. So that's been kind of a crash course in how you use Twitter and how you use Facebook, not things that were part of. Actually, when I ran in 2014 and took my seat in the Senate, we didn't use those. I mean, it was still, snail mail and putting out the brochures, and now we can connect with a lot of people and have ideas out there instantly. So that's something that quite surprising to me. And you've heard the expression herding cats. The reason we have that is that each district is a little different. The people you represent, there is diversity there, from the ag community to the coastal community that I represent. So finding the common thread with all of that is the job of the leader, so that some may have to and want to and need to represent their people vote for something that those of us in the coastal area can't support, vice versa. So those are the things that become a little, I think that's where we're a little challenged in ensuring that we've got the common thread, that we are representing California as a whole, but we're being respectful of the district, because it is a government of, by, and for the people. They sent us up here to represent them, those million people, and they expect me to do that, as these 12 other members have that same goal and requirement. So that really takes a lot of time. The thing I do miss as leader, I'm not so involved in the policy directly on committees. And my entry into the political world was on policy. I really enjoy that. I enjoy the intellectual challenge that presents in taking a bill. We both start from different paths. Hopefully at some point we come together, Democrat, Republican, say this is good for our people, this is good for California. And those are the things that challenge me and I really enjoy. And I miss that. I'm only on one committee, probably the best one. I'm on appropriations, so it's the spending. We're really going to spend money on that? Yeah, we need to spend money on that. So that's been, and I've had a great relationship with Senator Lara. He really respects, I go in to advocate for my members' bills, and he's been very open to allowing, where he might not allowing some bills to come through, because I've been able to convince them this is a place that the money needs to be spent, and he's been very receptive to that. I'm looking forward to our new pro tem, Senator Atkins, because she feels that, my job as leader of my caucus needs to be empowered in terms of getting the voices of the people, the 13 million people we represent. So those are, I think, as we go forward, kind of exciting new dimension to my job. And so I'm looking forward to going into if I get reelected, going into my next term, and with some perhaps new goals and objectives.
We always end these podcasts with a fun question. So I'm going to let you play tour guide for your district. We love wine at PRI. We're close to wine country in San Francisco, and certainly here in Sacramento with all the Amador region and everything. So you are fortunate to represent one of the most beautiful districts in the state. If we're down in your neck of the woods, what's the can't miss place, either a winery or place where visitors should go and enjoy a great adult beverage?
Well, we have the craft brewing industry along, they call it Hops Highway. That's 78 runs through Oceanside, Vista, the Carlsbad area. I would say that's really a great place to tour. And there's during the Oktoberfest, there's many opportunities for tastings, kind of like the wine country. It's become, very in thing to do. And many of the products that were originally kind of backyard brewers, they're in our beverage stores, in our liquor stores. So I think that would be a very important place to tour if you're coming down to test and taste beverages. Clearly, the 36th Senate District is the place to alight.
Senator Bates, thank you so much for your time and for joining us on PRI's podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again to our guest, Senator Pat Bates of California's 36th District. You can go to Senator Pat Bates on Facebook or at Senator Pat Bates on Twitter. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Also, check out our blog Right by the Bay on our website at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.